develops. Now, the head of the NHS in England, Simon Stevens, says the health service would be worse off if we decided to leave the EU. Two of his predecessors have also written a joint article in the Sunday Times saying that they think, for the NHS at least, staying in the EU is the preferable option. Mr. Stevens was on the Andrew Marr Show this morning. Here is what he had to say.
When Mark Carney says that the risk of a slowdown in economic growth, possibly a recession, if we end up exiting the EU, if Mark Carney is right, then that is a severe concern for the National Health Service, because it would be very dangerous if at precisely the moment the NHS is going to need extra funding, actually the economy goes into a tailspin and that funding is not there.
Simon Stevens. Now, Leave campaigners, unsurprisingly, take a different view. They argue that remaining in the EU will place further strain on the NHS due to continued free movement of people and the accession of new countries, like, as we've been saying, Turkey. So what is the relationship between our membership of the EU and the NHS? The Department of Health estimates that the cost to the NHS in England from visitors and non-permanent residents who come from the European Economic Area, that's the EU plus Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, is around £340 million a year. To put that in context, the total annual expenditure in England's NHS was £113 billion in 2014-15. There are around 3 million people from other EU countries resident in the UK, and all are entitled to use NHS services. All those would be entitled to stay in the UK even if we were to leave the EU due to their rights under the Vienna Convention. In 2015, around 257,000 EU nationals migrated to the UK. But whether that number would come down if we vote to leave depends on the deal the UK strikes with the EU following an exit. What about staffing in the NHS? NHS England says the total number of all staff coming from the EU countries was just over 53,000, or 4.6% of the total NHS workforce. A total of 9% of NHS England's hospital doctors, 6% of its nurses and health visitors come from other EU countries. However, all would be entitled to stay in the event of a vote to leave, and without knowing what any future deal might be, it's impossible to know if there would be any impact on staffing in the NHS. Joining me now, David Owen, one-time pro-European Foreign Secretary. He's now campaigning for the UK to leave the European Union. Good morning, David Owen. Let me come straight to the remarks made by the man currently running the NHS in England, Simon Stevens. He said it would be better for the NHS if we remain in the EU. What's your response?
Well, let's be quite clear. Simon Stevens is the manager of the NHS, which is currently £3 billion in debt. This man has presided now for a sufficient time to judge his management skills. In almost every part of the National Health Service, there is an acute crisis. He spent 10 years in America with an American healthcare company effectively arguing for the TTIP, this treaty between America and the European Union, which could, if introduced on the basis of a very important legal assessment created by or paid for by Unite, makes it very clear that TTIP will be very damaging to the National Health Service if it continues to be drafted in the way that it is. So Simon Stevens should better stick to his lathe, which is to manage the health service a great deal more successfully. He's an individual, he has a view on the European Union, that's fine, but his basic job is to look after the NHS, which at the moment he's currently making a very considerable mess of.
But it's not just Simon Stevens, is it? This morning, two of his predecessors in that job, Nigel Crisp and David Nicholson, they say staying in the EU is the preferable option.
Well, I don't think if there's any danger to the NHS, it is in staying in with all the elements of the NHS which are now involved with the EU. And for most of the first 20 years of our membership, the common market, we had no involvement with the NHS at all. Now the NHS procurement policy, the NHS competition policy is all impacting because we started to marketise the NHS in 2002 under Labour. It continued under the coalition with the Liberal Democrats of this present Conservative government, and it's continued under this Conservative government. If you treat health like oil, like water or electricity or gas as a utility, and you treat them all as customers, then you're going to be under market pressures. And the problem with the NHS is we lost what it was. It's fortunately still is, I may say, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but in England it's a marketised health service modelling itself on the United States of America.
Okay.
If you wanted to make changes, it would be wiser to stick to Germany or to France, certainly not go for the United States model.
All right, let me just put a point to you. Michael Gove, part of the Leave campaign, he claims the NHS could be overwhelmed by continued inward migration if we stay in the EU. He predicts an extra 5 million plus by 2030. But these projections assume that Turkey, Albania, Montenegro, Serbia and Macedonia all join the EU by 2020. That's just not on the cards, is it?
Well, let's be clear about your programme so far, and let's analyse what's been said already. It isn't the Prime Minister what he said in 2010 in Istanbul. The Prime Minister 9 weeks ago signed up to the European Council meeting on the 18th of March, in which he said, and let me check the wording so you're clear about it, to re-energise the accession process for Turkey to join the EU and to make preparatory work for the opening of other chapters will continue at an accelerating pace. Now, this is a Prime Minister who's getting used to saying one thing one time another. 9 weeks ago, we were committed to increasing the speed of entry of Turkey into the European Union. Now, I'm passionate about keeping Turkey inside NATO and with one foot in the EU and, of course, one foot in the Middle East. Why? Because Turkey is a central, important country as a member of NATO in dealing with ISIL, in dealing with Syria, in dealing with Iraq, and in many other problems around the world. But you won't make it by bringing them prematurely into the European Union. What we should be doing is encouraging them to come into the single market, which has non-EU countries associated, but without this issue of freedom of movement of labour. Well, this is the problem for all of us.
They are pretty much part of the single market already, but you are a former Foreign Secretary.
But they are not.
You must surely know. Let me ask this question.
Committed.
You must surely know that Turkey's chances of joining the EU in the foreseeable future are remote. Isn't that the reality?
No, I think what was said by your commentator earlier in the programme is there has been a change of foreign policy. Look, if the Prime Minister commits 9 weeks ago to speeding up Turkey membership and then doesn't deliver on it, what will be the consequences? Turkey will feel they have been lied to or rejected by the Europeans, and they will, in my view, come out of NATO with very profound consequences. So at the moment, let's treat Turkey with respect. Let's try and ensure that they make the necessary changes on human rights and in many other areas. There are a lot of worrying aspects about Turkish policy, but its membership of the European Union, in my view, is not the issue. It's how to make them more committed to Europe. And we cannot do this. Don't avoid this question. If we are in the European Union, we are committed to freedom of movement of labour in every aspect of EU membership. That's the problem.
All right, David Owen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us this morning.